I want to thank a couple of supporters that stepped up to the plate: Luke Victor, Nathan Torino, Cameron Batiste, and Peter Belingit. Thank you for your pledges. We put that call out back on Friday for support. Anyway, clear skies. Very common story in our part of Texas this time of year. Let's take a look at the surface analysis. There's the surface map for this afternoon, and we can see some very strong downslope across much of the Great Plains. North Dakota seeing 50s this afternoon, Denver 62, and 60s all the way from Rapid City down through Texas. East of the Mississippi River, we still have stagnant polar air in place, gradually being displaced by this warm air in the central U.S. And in the western U.S., we have the presence of a plateau high centered on the Snake River Valley and Great Basin region. And we can see the cool northerly flow across much of Arizona. 74 at Phoenix there with a northeast wind, and 63 at Kingman with a north wind. Typically, these plateau highs can be much stronger if there's cold air in place. And a lot of times this time of year in places like Salt Lake City and Boise, there can be overcast stratus, fog for many days with temperatures below freezing. However, obviously, we don't have anything like that going on today. It's clear, so that high is being maintained mostly by strong radiational cooling. And if we scroll back on Mountain Home Air Force Base, Idaho, we can see that they're at 38 right now, but they started out this morning at 15 degrees, so some very cold air in place in that region. As we can see, about the only front we have in the United States is this boundary running from Arkansas up to Minnesota, and we saw that there yesterday in a very similar location. And then up in Canada, that's where the storm track is, the jet stream coming on shore in British Columbia and across Ontario, and that's supporting this system here up in Hudson Bay. And I kept that warm front boundary very far north because these temperatures along Hudson Bay are quite warm. Normally we don't see cloudy, overcast weather with above freezing conditions this time of year there. And if you go further back behind the cold front, it's still a little bit mild for this time of year. We don't find the true Arctic air until we get up into the high Arctic. Minus 21 there at Rhea Point, west of Resolute, and I think that's Pond Inlet there, and that's probably about it. And typically when we're in a very cold weather regime, temperatures there will be running about minus 40, minus 30. So not really any particularly cold air up there at this time. To further investigate the air mass structure, we can look at the 1,000 through 500 millibar thickness and isobars. And this is showing the vast westerly flow across the northern U.S. And if we look at the thickness lines, we find thermal boundaries running up through the Midwest and over into southern Canada. The fronts are found on the equatorward side, so that's going to support a warm front right about there and further up north. Now, obviously, I brought that boundary much further north than what this chart indicates. So what's going on here? Let's take a look. Before we delve deeper into things, let's look at the jet stream pattern. This is 250 millibars, and we find the main branch of the polar front jet from the central Pacific, I should say the central North Pacific, into British Columbia, across Prince George, and then over to Winnipeg and down into western Illinois. Also, just of note, we have this cutoff low still spinning off the Los Angeles coast with a jet wrapped around that thing, and down to the south, subtropical jet along the Gulf Coast. And of course, very deep upper level low in New England. Now, typically, we don't find our fronts north of the jet stream. We find them along into the south. So this is added justification for pulling that front southward. Now, if we think about what we saw in that thickness chart, with the fronts being roughly like that, that's about where they should be. So I may have to go in and correct that surface analysis. So what's really going on there in central Canada? Well, here's the area that we're kind of concerned with. 30s. Maybe we should check out the high-resolution rapid refresh and see what the soundings look like. All right, there's the high-resolution rapid refresh. The suspected position of the fronts are going to be roughly like that. Let's take a look up there in Ontario. And we do see a frontal inversion, topped out at about 1 to 1.5 kilometers. Some warm air above that. So, yeah, we're going to have to move that front down south. North Dakota, just north of Grand Forks, frontal inversion. Okay. That appears to be our justification for moving the front southward. Okay, and I think that's probably a more representative look at what we're seeing in the northern U.S. and Canada. And it does make sense. There's not really a whole lot of temperature change on either side of that occluded front. And I think what threw me is I assumed that this air here was unrepresentatively warm. Maybe it was heated strongly by the sun, and perhaps downslope was a major factor, and I thought maybe that was just kind of inflating the temperature contrast. But apparently that's the real front, frontal inversion north of there, and this is all a cold air mass. So there you go. There's the corrected frontal analysis for the United States, and I suspect that this baroclinic zone in Saskatchewan could be the start of a new Alberta clipper moving towards the Great Lakes. It may not happen, but this would be a prime location for development. Okay, so here's the suspected baroclinic zone in southern Saskatchewan, and we'll run that into tonight. Yeah, it does look like there are pressure falls in northern North Dakota. There's the cold front coming south, and let's see what happens with that. Doesn't quite close off, but you can see that being carried into the Great Lakes area. And it looks like that's mostly washed out by tomorrow. New cyclogenesis out in Montana. Midday, the fronts are looking like that right there. And looks like that wave progresses eastward into Minnesota by Thursday. And right behind it, a fresh outbreak of cold air coming into the Central Plains. And you can see that we're getting snow there in Colorado. The full extent of that frontal boundary looks something like this here. So that's linked up back to something in California. So we're looking at late Thursday here, and then going into Friday. That moisture we talked about in the supporter stream yesterday, flowing up over the mountains in Mexico and northward with 1 to 1.5 inch precipitable water amounts in the lower Mississippi River Valley. So that'll sustain some of this convection moving out of Texas and Oklahoma. And there we go. Looks like a lot of it kind of falls apart a little bit towards Saturday, but very strong cold front moving south, the 540 decameter thickness line coming all the way down to the Dallas area. So it is going to be a cold weekend. And let's just see what we got for next week. Looks active in the northwestern U.S. and stagnant boundary down there in Texas also producing some activity. You can see that warm air advection firing some stuff there north of Houston and north of New Orleans. And that moves eastward. This is kind of like a pattern we might see during an El Nino year. The patterns, of course, are not rigid. They're not locked to whether it's an El Nino or La Nina year. There is some variation. And so we're going to break out of this fair weather pattern, very characteristic of La Nina, and get into a little temporary change here next week. So it does look cold for part of the month. And let's see here. Arctic outbreak indicated around Christmas, but at the GFS, constantly like the boy that cried wolf, always bringing Arctic air down after the 300-hour point. So we'll believe it when we see it. And we'll close with a little bit of mountain wave activity there in Montana. You can see those bands there. They're just kind of sitting there stationary downstream from the Rocky Mountains. And there's probably some very spectacular standing lenticular clouds in that formation. A couple of webcams. This is McDonald Pass near Helena, Montana. And yeah, those are definitely lenticular clouds. I-15, yeah, look at that. That's pretty awesome there. I'd imagine as the sun goes down, you would get some simply fantastic colors in those clouds. Okay, and that'll do it for this edition of Forecast Lab. Thank you for joining, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.